Friends, before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new audiobook, and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you in advance. Beauty and the Beast. The world, for Eleanor, was defined by the scent of ink and the quiet rustle of ledger pages. Her father, Alistair, was a man of substance, his wealth not flaunted but woven into the very grain of the oak-paneled library of their country house. He was a merchant of rare textiles, his hands more accustomed to the feel of silk and velvet than the rough bark of the forest that bordered their land. Eleanor, at 20, was his sole companion, her mother a ghost of a memory painted in gentle watercolors and a lingering trace of lavender in a forgotten drawer. Their life was one of comfortable silence, a tapestry of reading by the fire and discussing the accounts. It was a life Eleanor cherished for its predictability, its safety. But safety, like summer, is a season that must end. The journey to the royal city was a necessary evil. A debt owed, a fortune to be collected. Alistair kissed Eleanor's forehead, his touch dry and warm. "I will return before the first frost, my dear. Keep the ledgers tidy." He did not return before the first frost. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The first snow dusted the hills, and Eleanor's worry curdled into a cold, sharp fear. Then, on a night when the wind screamed like a banshee around the eaves, he returned. He was a phantom of the man who had left. His fine cloak was gone, his clothes torn and stained with mud and something darker, something that looked like old wine but smelled of iron. A deep gash, poorly stitched, marred his temple, and he moved with the stiff, pained caution of one whose bones have been remade by violence. "Bandits," he rasped, collapsing into his chair by the fire. The story spilled out in fractured, shame-filled pieces. Ambushed on the forest road. Beaten. Robbed of everything, including the gold he was meant to collect. Left for dead in the frozen mud. "I don't know how long I crawled," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the flames, seeing a horror Eleanor could only imagine. "The cold was in my bones. I was ready to let go, to just sleep. Then I saw a light." He described stumbling through a thicket of thorns so dense they seemed like a wall, into a clearing that felt unnaturally silent. And there, standing against the lashing storm, was a mansion. It was a carcass of a place, its stones blackened with age and damp, its windows blind eyes veiled by ivy. It looked as if the forest itself was slowly, patiently, digesting it. The door was unlocked, Alistair continued, his voice dropping to a hush. "I fell inside, expecting dust and rot. But, it was warm." His eyes widened with the memory of the impossible. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. A single, long table was set with a feast, a roasted fowl, a loaf of dark bread, a carafe of deep red wine. The air was clean, scented with beeswax and dried herbs. It was pristine, orderly, and utterly desolate. He ate. He drank. The wine was rich and heavy, dulling the pain. He remembered collapsing into a deep, dreamless sleep by the fire's warmth. He awoke in a different world. A bedchamber of such opulence it made his own wealth seem provincial. He was swathed in clean, soft linen, his wounds expertly cleaned and bandaged. Sunlight, pale and weak, streamed through a tall window, illuminating tapestries that told stories of forgotten battles and lost loves. That was when the master appeared. He did not enter so much as congeal from the shadows in the corner of the room, Alistair said, a tremor running through him. His name was Lord Lysander. And he was a monument to suffering made flesh. One shoulder was hunched, pulled high towards his ear, forcing his neck into a perpetual, painful-looking tilt. His face was a landscape of asymmetry, the bones beneath having healed from some primordial violence in a way that was fundamentally wrong. One eye was a fraction lower than the other, his mouth pulled into a permanent, slight sneer. He was dressed in exquisitely tailored black, the fabric only serving to highlight the deformity it sought to conceal. He was terrifying. But his voice, when he spoke, was like dark velvet, cultured and cold. He told me he had found me dying and had his servants tend to me, Alistair recounted. He said a life was a debt, and all debts must be paid. The fire crackled, the only sound in the heavy silence. Eleanor's heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. "What was the price, father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair would not meet her gaze. He stared into the flames as if seeking absolution. "He is a powerful man. A lonely man. The price was companionship." He finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a shame so profound it seemed to shrink him. "Your hand, Eleanor. In marriage." The air left the room. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. Marriage? To a monster in a ruined house? "I refused," Alistair said, the lie brittle. "I told him I could not. But he was implacable. He said the debt of a life could only be paid with a life. My life, or a life I held dear." His shoulders slumped. He showed me a way home. A mirror in the great hall. He said to look into it, to think of this library, and I would be here. He said I had 3 days. 3 days to bring you back, or the debt would be called in another way. He gestured weakly to a large, leather-wrapped package on the table. He gave me that. A wedding gift, he called it. With numb fingers, Eleanor untied the cords. Inside was a gown of midnight blue velvet, so dark it was almost black. It was exquisitely made, the fabric heavy and sensuous against her skin. As she lifted it, something fell to the floor with a soft chime. A small, hand-held mirror, its frame of tarnished silver, wrought in the shape of thorns. She picked it up. Her own pale, frightened face stared back. And for a fleeting second, in the dark depths of the glass, she thought she saw another reflection, a pair of cold, sorrowful eyes, watching her from a great distance. Her father wept, silent, broken sobs. He had traded his daughter for his life. The comfortable world of ink and ledgers was gone, shattered by a deal made in a shadowy hall. The choice was no choice at all. It was a sentence. The journey was a blur of gray skies and skeletal trees. Eleanor sat in the carriage, the velvet gown folded beside her like a shroud. Her father, hunched and silent, had not met her eyes since they left the familiar comfort of their estate. He had led her to the library, to the same mirror he had returned through. It was no longer a simple sheet of glass. It pulsed with a faint, silvery light, showing not their reflection, but a swirling, misty corridor. "Think of the great hall," her father had whispered, his voice thick with grief. "Just step through." She had taken his hand, a final, desperate clutch, and then stepped into the cold. It was not a step, but a falling, a sensation of being pulled through a river of ice. When the world solidified again, the scent of home, beeswax and old books, was gone, replaced by the scent of stone, cold air, and a faint, cloying perfume of dried roses. She stood in the great hall. It was exactly as her father had described, yet his words had failed to capture its oppressive grandeur. The vaulted ceiling was lost in shadow, the stone walls adorned with tapestries so old their colors had faded to ghosts. They depicted scenes of hunt and harvest, but the threads were frayed, and in the dim light, the figures seemed to writhe in silent agony. A long, polished table of obsidian black wood ran the length of the room, set for one. A single, high-backed chair was pulled before a silver platter and a crystal goblet. The air was warm, courtesy of the immense fireplace where logs the size of tree trunks crackled and spat, yet the heat did not penetrate the chill in her bones. The silence was the most profound she had ever experienced. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, listening silence that pressed against her eardrums. This was to be her home. This beautiful, sterile, silent tomb. Her trunk, which she had packed with trembling hands, appeared at her feet moments later, as if pushed through an unseen door. There were no servants. No footsteps. Only the whisper of the flames. Days bled into one another. She explored the mansion, a labyrinth of corridors and deserted chambers. A music room held a harp with broken strings. A library contained books bound in leather so ancient it crumbled at her touch. Every room was immaculate, dust-free, yet steeped in an air of profound abandonment. She would sometimes catch a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye, a curtain rustling, a shadow detaching itself from a wall, but when she turned, there was nothing. The mansion was alive, but its life was a secret, hidden from her. She ate alone at the great table. Food and wine would appear on the silver platter the moment she sat down, always perfectly prepared, always exquisitely presented. It was sustenance without soul, a ritual of loneliness. She slept in the opulent bedchamber her father had described, in a bed large enough for 5, the silken sheets cold as a winter lake. And then, there was him. Lord Lysander. He never sought her out. He was a ghost in his own house. She would see him sometimes, a dark, hunched silhouette at the end of a long gallery, watching her before melting back into the shadows. Or she would enter a room and feel the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the residual heat of a recent presence, the faint scent of sandalwood and old parchment that clung to him. The first time he spoke to her directly, she was in the library, daring to run a finger along a spine that seemed more intact than the others. It was a volume on celestial navigation. "The stars are liars," his voice came from the doorway, making her jump. He stood there, a crooked monument in the frame. "They promise direction, but they are only cold, distant fires. They care nothing for the lost ships below." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the book like a shield. "My lord." He did not enter. His mismatched eyes, one a cool gray, the other a stormy blue, swept over her, and she felt laid bare, assessed. "Do you find my library lacking?" "It is extensive," she managed, her voice thin. A diplomat's answer. A hint of a sneer twisted his already twisted mouth. "You may read whatever you wish. The books have been silent too long. Though I warn you, most of their wisdom is obsolete. The world they describe is dead." He left as silently as he had arrived, leaving her trembling, the book cold in her hands. That was their longest interaction for a week. Her fear was a constant, cold companion. But as the days turned into a fortnight, a new, more dangerous emotion began to stir alongside it, a terrible, aching curiosity. Who was this man? What tragedy had sculpted his body and his soul into such a bleak landscape? One evening, driven by a desperation she could no longer contain, she did not go to the great hall for her solitary meal. Instead, she followed the faint sound of a piano, a single, melancholic note repeated over and over, coming from a room she had not yet dared to enter. The door was ajar. Inside, lit by a single candelabra, was a small study. Books and papers were piled in organized chaos on every surface. And there, at a grand piano, sat Lord Lysander. His deformed hands, which she had only seen clenched or still, were resting on the keys. He was not playing a melody, but pressing one key, listening to the note fade into the silence, then pressing it again. The sorrow in the simple act was so profound it stole her breath. He sensed her. His head lifted, but he did not turn. "The A is slightly flat," he said, his voice devoid of its usual coldness. "It was merely tired. It has been for a century. I keep thinking I will have it tuned, but the flaw has become familiar. I would miss its imperfection." Eleanor stood in the doorway, the velvet of her gown whispering against the wood. The beast was not a monster. He was a man, sitting in the dark, mourning a flat piano key. And in that moment, her fear began, irrevocably, to crack. The silence of the mansion changed after that night. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space. Eleanor began to find small, deliberate disruptions in the sterile order of her days. A different book would be left on the table in the great hall, open to a page of poetry or a star chart, as if inviting comment. The single place setting at the obsidian table was joined, one evening, by a second, a crystal goblet and silver cutlery placed opposite hers. He did not come that night. But the invitation was clear. It was another week before he joined her. She was picking at a dish of roasted pheasant when the soft fall of his footsteps made her look up. He moved with a strange, lurching grace, his form a dark slash against the fire-lit tapestries. He did not speak as he took the seat across from her. The distance of the long table suddenly felt cavernous. They ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken words. The clink of her fork against the plate was deafening. She watched his hands, the long, strong fingers, the knuckles misshapen, as they carefully cut his meat. There was a refined precision to his movements that belied his brutish appearance. "Does the food not please you?" he finally asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the table. "It is exquisite, my lord," she said, her own voice too high, too bright. I am merely unaccustomed to such richness. Or to such company, he stated, his stormy eyes lifting to hers. It was not an accusation, merely a fact. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck. The company is new. A ghost of a smile, more a grimace, touched his lips. New. A charitable word. He took a sip of wine. You are not what I expected, Eleanor. The sound of her name on his tongue, spoken not as a master's command but as a simple statement, sent an unwelcome shiver through her. What did you expect, my lord? Tears. Hysterics. A constant, grating fear. Not this, quiet observation. You watch everything. You see too much. There is little else to do but see, she replied, a spark of defiance igniting within her. You have given me a gilded cage, Lord Lysander. It is only natural for the bird to study its bars. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. The fire cast shifting shadows across his ruined face, sometimes highlighting the harsh planes, sometimes softening them. And what have you concluded about your keeper? She met his gaze, her heart thudding. This was dangerous ground. That he is a man who values silence, but cannot abide the echo of his own. That he surrounds himself with beauty, yet seems to derive no joy from it. That he saved a man's life, yet acts as though he committed a crime. The air stilled. For a terrifying second, she thought she had gone too far. His knuckles were white where he gripped his goblet. Then, the tension seeped out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. A crime, he repeated softly, looking into the depths of his wine. Perhaps it was. To chain a songbird to a stone is a crime, is it not? He looked up, and the raw, unguarded sorrow in his eyes was more shocking than any display of anger. Your father, he looked at me as if I were death himself. I merely offered him a choice. Most men, when faced with death, will grasp at any branch, even if it is thorns. And what of my choice? Eleanor whispered, the question hanging between them, fragile and damning. Lysander's gaze did not waver. You had none. That is the nature of a debt. It is paid by those who incur it, and sometimes, by those they love. He pushed his chair back, the sound unnaturally loud. Forgive me. My company has soured your meal. He left her then, his hunched form disappearing into the gloom of the corridor. Eleanor sat, her food forgotten, the taste of the rich wine now bitter on her tongue. The beast had not roared. He had confessed. And in his confession, she had seen not a monster, but a man drowning in a solitude of his own making. The thorns of her cage, she realized, were not just of his design. They were woven from his pain. And that made them infinitely more dangerous. A fragile truce settled over the mansion. The silent meals became a ritual. Lysander would appear, a dark sentinel, and they would dine in the cavernous hall, the fire their only other companion. The conversations were stilted at first, orbiting safe topics, the weather described in the books she read, the history of a tapestry, the composition of a particular wine. But slowly, the orbits tightened. He began to speak of the world outside, not as it was, but as he remembered it from a century past. He spoke of court intrigues with a cynical wit, of philosophies now considered archaic, of music that had long faded from living memory. His voice, that dark velvet instrument, lost its edge of frost when he spoke of these things. It became animated, almost warm. Eleanor found herself listening, captivated not just by the knowledge, but by the passion he so carefully concealed. She, in turn, began to speak of her own life. Of her mother's laugh, a sound she could barely recall. Of the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger. Of the way the light fell through the library window at home on a summer afternoon. She spoke, and he listened with an intensity that was unnerving. He absorbed her words as a parched man drinks water. One afternoon, she found him in the music room, standing before the broken harp. His deformed hand hovered over the snapped strings, not touching them. "It was my mother's," he said, not turning. The admission was quiet, offered like a rare coin. She had a voice like starlight. "I shattered the harp the day she died. A fit of childish grief. A permanent, foolish monument to a temporary pain." He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Some breaks cannot be mended. Not all music needs strings," Eleanor heard herself say. She walked to the piano and sat, the stool cool beneath her. She was no virtuoso, but her mother had taught her simple folk songs, melodies of the hearth and the harvest. She placed her fingers on the cold ivory and began to play. The notes were halting, simple, a stark contrast to the mansion's grand sorrow. She played a lullaby. When she finished, the silence felt different. Softer. She felt him before she saw him. He had moved to stand behind her, a tall, dark presence. She could feel the heat of him, smell the sandalwood and parchment scent that was uniquely his. Her breath caught. His shadow fell over her, over the keys. Then, his hand, his twisted, powerful hand, came down beside hers on the piano. He did not touch her. He pressed a key, a rich, deep C-sharp that resonated in the still air. "That one is still true," he murmured, his voice so close it was a vibration in her very bones. The space between their hands on the keyboard was infinitesimal. A chasm. A promise. She could feel the pull of him, a terrifying, magnetic force. This was no longer curiosity. It was a current, live and humming, in the air between them. It was the first thread of something that felt dangerously like trust, spun from shared silence and a single, true note. It was a week later when the storm came. It raged outside the stone walls with a fury that seemed personal, shaking the window panes and howling down the chimneys. Eleanor had never liked storms. In her old life, she would burrow under the covers in her safe, familiar room. Here, in the vastness of her chamber, each thunderclap felt like a physical blow. A particularly violent crack of lightning, followed instantly by a roar of thunder that shook the very foundations of the mansion, broke her. A small, terrified sound escaped her lips. She huddled by the cold fireplace, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling like a child. The door to her chamber opened without a sound. Lysander stood there, a lamp in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows. He was dressed in a dark robe, his hair disheveled as if he too had been roused from his bed. He did not enter, respecting the invisible boundary of her space. "The storm frightens you," he said. It was not a question. She could only nod, ashamed of her fear. He hesitated, a war of impulses playing out on his face. Then, he did something extraordinary. He stepped inside, placed the lamp on a table, and sat on the floor, his back against the wall opposite her, just within the circle of lamplight. He made no move to come closer. "I used to fear them too," he said, his gaze fixed on the dark window where rain lashed the glass. "When I was a boy. I was told it was the gods arguing. It made the world feel unstable." He leaned his head back against the stone. "Now, I find a strange comfort in them. The chaos outside mirrors the chaos within. There is a honesty to it." He began to talk. Not of courts or history, but of simple things. Of the way the forest smelled after a rain. Of the taste of wild strawberries stolen from the kitchen garden as a child. His voice was a low, steady counterpoint to the storm's fury, a rope thrown to her in a churning sea. Eleanor listened, her fear slowly ebbing, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. The beast, the monstrous lord of the manor, was sitting on her floor in the middle of the night, telling her stories to calm her fears. When the storm finally began to subside, leaving behind only the gentle patter of rain, his stories faded into silence. They sat that way for a long time, the lamp guttering between them, the space charged with an intimacy that was more potent than any touch. Finally, he rose. He looked at her, his face all shadows and sharp angles in the dying light. "Sleep, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she dared not name. "The gods have finished their arguing for the night." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor remained on the floor, the cold stone seeping through her nightdress. But inside, she was warm. The thread of trust had been woven into a cord, strong and resilient. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was no longer a songbird chained to a stone. She was a woman, and she was beginning to love the shadow that kept her safe from the storm. The fragile world they had built was a castle of glass, beautiful and perilous. It could not last. The turning point was a letter, delivered not by any visible hand, but left upon her breakfast platter. It was from her father. The script was shaky, the words stained with what looked like tears. He was ill. A fever had taken hold of his lungs after a harsh winter. He did not plead, but the despair between the lines was a scream in the silence. "My dearest Eleanor, if you can, if it is safe. I fear I may not see the spring, *. The paper crumpled in her hand. The luxurious food turned to ash in her mouth. The warmth she had found in Lysander's presence was suddenly a cage of guilt. Her father was dying, alone, believing he had sold his daughter to a monster. She found Lysander in his study, bent over a map of constellations that were no longer in the sky. The sight of him, so absorbed in his lost world, made her plea catch in her throat. He looked up, and the slight, unguarded softening in his eyes at the sight of her hardened instantly as he took in her distress. "What has happened?" She held out the crumpled letter, her hand trembling. "My father. He is dying." He took the paper, his twisted fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, like static, passed between them. He read it, his expression impassive. When he finished, he placed it carefully on his desk. "I see." "Please," Eleanor whispered, the word tearing from her. "I must see him. I must go to him." Lysander turned his back to her, looking out the window at the perpetually overgrown gardens. His hunched silhouette was a monument to isolation. The terms of our arrangement were clear. "This is your home now. He is my father." The cry was wrenched from her soul. "You, who understand loss, you would keep me from his deathbed. What kind of love would that be?" The word hung in the air, shocking and true. She had never spoken it aloud. He went very still. "Love," he repeated, the word a bitter taste. "A dangerous word to use in this house, Eleanor." He turned, and his face was a mask of cold control, but his eyes were turbulent. "You wish to go through the mirror?" "Yes. It is not a simple journey. The magic is particular. It demands a price. I will pay it." "You do not know the cost," he snarled, a flash of the beast she had first feared. "The world out there is not this one. They will see you, a woman appearing from nowhere, from a place of legend and fear. They will not see your heart. They will see a witch, a specter. I have to try." He studied her for a long, agonizing moment, the battle within him visible in the clench of his jaw, the tightness of his shoulders. Finally, the fight left him in a long, weary sigh. He walked to a cabinet and took out the small, thorn-framed mirror she had arrived with. "Take this," he said, his voice hollow. "It is a twin to the one in your father's house. To return, you must look into it, and think of this hall. Think of me. The portal will open. But know this, Eleanor." His stormy eyes captured hers, holding her with an intensity that felt like a physical grip. "The mirror's magic is fueled by connection. By memory. If you tarry too long, if the world of light and noise and familiar faces clouds what we have built here, the connection may sever. The way back may be lost to you forever." It was a greater risk than any bandit or storm. The price was not gold or blood, but the very bond that had become the foundation of her life. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. He nodded, a sharp, pained gesture. "Then go. Tend to your father. But remember the thorns, songbird. Remember the stone." He turned away, dismissing her. As she clutched the cold mirror and hurried from the study, she did not see the way his deformed hand slammed onto the desk, the wood splintering under the force of his grief and fear. He had let his songbird fly, and he was certain, in the deepest, most broken part of himself, that she would never return to her cage. The journey back was a nauseating lurch through a tunnel of silver mist. When her senses righted themselves, she was standing in her father's library. The familiar scent of old books and beeswax was a physical blow, so potent with memory it made her dizzy. Sunlight, real and golden, streamed through the window. For a moment, it was paradise. "Eleanor." The voice was a frail rasp. Her father stood in the doorway, a ghost of the robust man she remembered. He was thinner, his skin pale and papery, but he was alive. The fever had broken. A sob tore from her throat, and she flew into his arms. For a long time, they simply held each other, weeping. The first days were a balm. She tended to him, cooking simple meals, reading to him by the fire, the small thorn-framed mirror hidden safely in her trunk. She told him carefully edited stories of the mansion, of its vast library, its quiet peace. She did not speak of the sorrow in Lysander's eyes, of the storm, of the terrifying, tender bond that had grown between them. She called him, the Lord, a distant, reclusive benefactor. But the world had not stood still in her absence. A guest had taken up residence in their house, Seraphine, a distant cousin of her mother's, who had inserted herself as a governess and companion to Alistair during his illness. She was a woman with eyes the color of a shallow stream and a smile that never reached them. She watched Eleanor with a predatory curiosity. It was Seraphine who saw it. On the third day, needing a moment away from the stifling concern, Eleanor had gone to the library and, her heart aching with a strange homesickness for the dark halls, she had taken the mirror from her trunk. She hadn't meant to use it, only to hold it, to feel its connection to him. As she gazed into its depths, wondering if he was looking into its twin, the silver surface had swirled, and for a fleeting second, the reflection of the sunlit library had been replaced by the image of a stone archway and a flickering torch. A gasp from the doorway. Eleanor snapped the mirror shut, her heart leaping to her throat. Seraphine stood there, her face a mask of shock and triumphant horror. "I knew it," Seraphine whispered. "There was always something unnatural about your return. The way you appeared so suddenly. The strange gown. The look in your eyes, you've been consorting with demons. It is not what you think." Eleanor pleaded, but it was too late. The poison spread quickly. Seraphine was a respected, if not well-liked, figure in the village. Her whispers of witchcraft, of pacts with dark forces, of a girl returned from the dead woods wrong, found fertile ground in a community steeped in superstition and fear. The story warped and grew. Eleanor was no longer a victim of a strange bargain, she was a willing priestess of some forest devil, sent back to curse them all. The village turned against them. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Rocks were thrown through the library window. Alistair, weakened and horrified, tried to defend her, but his voice was lost in the rising tide of hysteria. The end came at dawn. The local magistrate, a pragmatic man swayed by the mob's fury, arrived with armed men. They burst into the house, their faces hard and fearful. "Eleanor, daughter of Alistair," the magistrate intoned, his voice shaking slightly. "You are accused of witchcraft and consorting with infernal powers. You will come with us." There was no trial. There was only the cold, damp stone of a prison cell. It was a small, reeking hole in the ground, far darker and more real than any shadow in Lysander's mansion. They had taken her clothes, given her a rough-spun shift. They had taken the mirror. Through the small, barred window, she could hear the carpenters building the pyre in the town square. This was the world of light. It was not kind. It was not safe. It was brutal, ignorant, and terrified of anything it could not understand. Huddled on the straw pallet, the cold seeping into her bones, Eleanor closed her eyes. She did not think of the sun. She thought of the fire in the great hall. She did not think of her father's face. She thought of a pair of stormy, sorrowful eyes. She thought of a single, true note on a piano. She remembered the thorns. She remembered the stone. And she knew, with a despair more profound than any she had felt in the mansion, that she might never see them again. The connection was stretched to its breaking point, and the mirror was gone. Her love had not been enough to bridge the worlds. It had only led her to a different kind of cage, with a far more final door. The world had shrunk to the size of a single, rancid thought, the scent of oil and timber, carried on the wind through the barred window. The pyre was ready. Eleanor's time was measured in breaths, each one shallower than the last. Hope was a dead language. She had prayed to the gods of this world, and they had answered with a mob and a pile of wood. She thought of Lysander, a continent of silence away, and her heart did not break, for it was already dust. In the mansion, the silence had become a scream. Lysander stood before the great mirror in the hall, its surface dull, reflecting only the dark, empty room behind him. He had felt it, the moment her connection had frayed, the moment terror had eclipsed all thought of him. And then, nothing. A void. He had thrown goblets, shattered chairs, his roars echoing through the stone halls. But the violence brought no release, only a clearer view of the abyss. He had sent her into the fire, and he had stayed safe in his castle of shadows. He would not. He turned from the dead mirror and went to the one place in the mansion that held a different power, his study. From a locked chest, he drew out an object wrapped in black velvet. A pistol, beautifully crafted, its stock inlaid with silver. A weapon from his old life, a final, desperate link to a world of action he had forsaken. He loaded it with hands that trembled not with fear, but with a terrible, focused purpose. He did not use the mirror. He walked out of the mansion's great front door, a thing he had not done in a lifetime. The overgrown thorns clawed at his cloak as he strode into the forest, his distorted form moving with a predator's grace through the familiar darkness. The journey that had taken Alistair days by carriage, Lysander covered in a single, relentless night, his body fueled by a fury that was colder and sharper than any blade. He arrived at Alistair's estate as the sun rose, painting the sky in gentle pastels that mocked the violence in his soul. He did not knock. He shoved the door open, the frame splintering. Alistair, haggard and broken, cried out in terror at the sight of the monstrous lord in his home. "Where is she?" Lysander's voice was gravel, stripped of all its velvet. "They took her." Alistair wept, collapsing to his knees. "The prison, they mean to burn her at noon. There is no one who will help." "I will help," Lysander said. He outlined his plan with a brutal, military clarity. Alistair knew the head jailer, a man named Gregor, a man whose loyalty could be purchased. "You will get me inside. The rest is mine." The plan was a fragile thread of deception and violence. Alistair, playing the repentant father, went to the prison with a purse of gold Lysander had provided, begging for a final moment with his daughter. He was admitted, the gold greasing the lock. Lysander, shrouded in a heavy cloak, followed as his mute servant. The prison stank of fear and filth. As they reached the lower levels, the charade shattered. A guard, younger and more suspicious, demanded the servant show his face. When Lysander did not move, the guard reached for him. What happened next was not a fight, it was a slaughter. Lysander moved with a speed that was inhuman. The pistol was a thunderclap in the confined space, felling one man. The others he took apart with his hands, a whirlwind of brutal, efficient force. He was not a nobleman, he was the beast they had always feared, his deformity a weapon, his strength terrifying. Bones snapped. Choking gurgles filled the corridor. Alistair watched, paralyzed, as the man he had feared for his cold intellect revealed the raw, savage power beneath. They found Eleanor's cell. Lysander shattered the lock with a single, powerful kick. She was curled in the corner, her face hollow, her eyes vacant. When she saw him, silhouetted in the doorway amidst the carnage, a choked sob escaped her. Lysander. He did not speak. He swept her into his arms, her lightness a fresh agony. We must go. Now. The escape was a bloody blur. More guards came. Lysander shielded her with his body, taking a glancing blow from a pike that tore through his shoulder, a deep gash from a sword that bit into his side. He fought on, a wounded lion, his only thought to create a path for her. He was a tapestry of blood and fury, his dark clothes soaked, his breath coming in ragged, pained gasps. They burst out of the prison into the blinding square. The pyre stood in the center, a stark, terrifying promise. The mob, gathered for the spectacle, froze at the sight of the bloody, monstrous man carrying the condemned witch. Demon, someone shrieked. A rock flew, catching Lysander on the temple. He staggered but did not fall, clutching Eleanor tighter. Run! Alistair screamed, pointing towards the house. They ran, a desperate, limping sprint through a gauntlet of hatred. They reached the library, slamming the door shut, barring it as fists and clubs began to pound from the outside. Lysander slumped against the wall, his strength finally failing. Blood poured from his shoulder and side, pooling on the familiar rug. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He was dying. The mirror, he rasped, his eyes finding Eleanor's. Now. Alistair, weeping, handed Eleanor the small, thorn-framed glass they had retrieved from the magistrate's chest. She held it, her tears falling onto the silvered surface. Look, Lysander whispered, his voice fading. Think of home. Eleanor clutched his hand, their blood mingling. She looked into the mirror. She did not think of the great hall, or the fire, or the tapestries. She thought of him. Of his sorrow, his intelligence, the hidden gentleness in his stormy eyes. She thought of the man who had sat on her floor to quiet her fears. The mirror's surface swirled, then cleared. But it did not show the great hall. It showed a reflection of the library, of her kneeling, holding the hand of the dying, monstrous man. And as she watched, as her love for him, for all of him, the beast and the man, filled her heart to breaking, the reflection changed. In the glass, the blood vanished. The wounds closed. The hunched back straightened. The asymmetrical features softened, resolved, into a face of heartbreaking nobility and beauty. Lord Lysander, as he was meant to be, whole and radiant, looked back at her, his eyes full of a peace he had never known in life. He smiled. In her arms, the real Lysander shuddered, a final, soft breath leaving his body. His hand went limp in hers. A sound like a universe cracking apart filled the room. The thorn-framed mirror, and the great one on the wall, shattered simultaneously into 1,000 glittering shards. The pounding at the door ceased. The world went quiet. Alistair stood amid the glittering fragments, the body of the beast at his feet, his daughter weeping over it. He looked at the empty frame where the mirror had been, the portal closed forever. He would never see his daughter again. She was gone to a world he could not follow, a world that existed now only in the ghost of a reflection. But as he looked at Eleanor, at the profound, tragic love on her face, he felt a strange, searing peace cut through his grief. His daughter was lost to him. But she had loved, and her love had, in its own tragic way, redeemed the beast. He was alone, forever, among the shards of broken magic. But in that silence, there was no monster, and there was no witch. There was only the echo of a sacrifice, and the terrible, beautiful cost of a love that had crossed two worlds. If you found yourself lost in the thorns and shadows of this tale, if the echo of a shattered mirror still lingers in your thoughts, then your journey with us is a treasure. To ensure you never miss a story, subscribe to the channel. Let us know the reflection this story left in your heart. Your comments and likes are the magic that guides us to our next dark romance. What tragic love should we narrate next? Until then, in the silence between worlds.